Keshavan, CGM in State Bank of India. See, before we get into the topic, let me say a word about the chamber. As I was talking casually, see, we have started many activities. We have a CEO forum meeting. We have started an India Forward series. And India Forward series is a common forum wherein opinion makers and policy makers generally discuss with us about their vision of India Forward. And this series has been going great, and it is great, getting rave reviews. The fourth session, as I was talking casually, is now scheduled for the 16th of December, and Mr. Montak Singh Ahluwalia is the speaker. See, for the benefit of the honorable guest, let me tell you that we had Mr. Jairam Ramesh and Mr. S. Gurumurthy, and of course, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, the former finance minister, as the speakers in our previous sessions. And apart from this, we are also committed to the CSR activity as any responsible corporate citizen should be. And as part of the CSR activity, by pooling in money from all our members, we donated a high-cost medical equipment to a government hospital in Cochin, and the handing over was done by the Honorable Minister Shri P. Rajiv. And I take this opportunity to say that the Chamber CSR Fund also has got the ATG exemption, so that tax benefit can be availed by donating companies, and your CSR obligation can be met through the chamber. See, instead of individual money getting spent, we thought if we pull in the resources, we'll be able to make it a worthy donation so that it can make a difference to the society at large. And as part of the chamber activities now, because the COVID is presumably coming down, we have also planned a workshop, though of course it is on the platform, virtual platform. We have this platform. This is scheduled for a personal branding by Ms. Jessica Mundroina on 18 December. See, now let us get to the topic. See, banks, you know, as an integral part of our lives, and we all, especially people from the South, where the banking system is more dependent upon, we all want a proper and efficient banking system, because that is basically where our money is. And coming to Kerala, Kerala itself has, Mr. Adi Keshavan will be able to talk, Kerala has more than 6 lakh crore deposit in the banks. So what exactly we want to get a good night's sleep? We want a healthy bank and a proper banking system. See, our worries got accentuated by the failures of banks which we have been reading in the papers, whether it is Karivannur Cooperative Bank or whether it is the PMC Bank in Maharashtra. We also saw the failure of more reputed banks like LVB or even S Bank. So what exactly we want is, as I was saying, we want an efficient banking system. Whether it is in the private sector, whether it is in the public sector, I think it is only secondary. And talking about the privatization, I think it has come to a full circle where, as far as the ownership is concerned, it was in the year 1969, if I recall correctly, that 14 banks were nationalized. And in 80, another 6 banks were nationalized. So totally almost around 20 banks were nationalized. That time, the stated reason for nationalization was to give government more control of credit delivery. And with the second round of nationalization, the government controlled more than 91% of the banking business. Yes, it had its plus points, because the number of branches increased to almost around 54,000. The last mile connectivity increased. And it can also be argued that the bank penetration to rural areas has played a major role in improving rural prosperity or even the agriculture prosperity, even rural employment, or even starting of the MSMEs in the rural areas and all that. And of course, the bank employees also increased. So on a job giving front also, the nationalization helped. But the flip side was NPS also increased, efficiency reduced, so to say. And recently we have been seeing that the banks are being subjected to a lot of PCA corrections. Despite nursing under PCA regulations for a considerable period, many of the banks still continue to be plagued by high NPAs, capital constraints, and low credit growth. and the government is compelled to pump in more money to maintain the capital adequacy. Now the government, rightly or wrongly, has decided that privatization of banks is the answer to all the problems. And Reserve Bank of India has raised and a lot of modifications are coming, a lot of amendments are coming. And Reserve Bank of India recently made it more investor friendly, wherein the long-term cap on promoter stake, allowing them to hold 26% instead of 15% subsequently. And it allows promoters to maintain without any ceiling to begin with for the first 5 years. And all these things are basically to attract capital to the bank so that more investors come to take over the banks. And we also have seen the capitalization, the market capitalization of the banks went up considerably. And companies like DCB Bank, Kotak, and even HDFC benefited hugely. And today HDFC has almost a market capitalization of more than $122 billion, making it the 114th most valuable bank in the country, in the world. And even our own SBI, I think, has only half of the market capitalization of SBI. And even other banks like ICICI, STFC, or even Bajaj Finance has a higher market capitalization than SBI. That's what I understand. See, it's a fact that nationalized banks are a comfort to the common man, because people have a feeling that if as long as it is with the government, there is always a redressal forum available, because otherwise you end up talking to some unknown number, you end up talking to some call center, you keep on pressing one after two after three, and you may get a response or you may not get a response. So actually, in a society where people are more dependent on banks, this is a huge comfort for the common man. See, the arguments for privatization can be political, it can be economic, it can be anything. But the fact is, more professionalism is expected to bring in a reduction in the NPAs, and the government will not have to pump in more money to keep the capital adequacy. And now, even the bank employees are at war with the government, asking for no privatization. And even the agriculture, recently the farmers agitation hero Tikayat, he also has thrown in his towel saying that the bank should not be privatized. So all these issues are going on. So I think we have a right person, a CGM, at the State Bank of India, the country's nationalized biggest bank, and he's a reputed columnist. He always comes out with articles on his personal opinion on very many issues. And he has a lot of 36 years experience, and right now he is in the strategy group of the State Bank of India. So I think we could not have got or asked for a better person than him. So I welcome all the members of the forum, the invited guests, and of course the sponsors of the CEO forum, Mrs. Mahindra Holidays. Over to you, Mr. Adikesavan. We are all eyes and ears for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thanks to the other members for logging in so early for this interaction on a topic which has been contextualized by Sri Harikumar so brilliantly. I joined the bank in 1985 as a probationary officer, and looking back, banking has undergone so many changes. In 1987, for instance, when I was a field officer, a housing loan was not possible to be given by a public sector bank because the RBI felt that credit should flow only to the productive sectors of the economy. So I remember in 1987 or 88, when people used to come for loans for housing purposes, there were responses of that we cannot give you because it's not for a productive purpose. And then probably they would come and take loans in some other form maybe saying it is for a business purpose and use it for housing. That was in the 1980s, late 1980s. Then in the 1990s, as we know, the major economic reforms happened, on account of which the new private sector banks came into the scene. Reforms in the banking sector also concurrently happened, along with the reforms in all other sectors of the economy. So the India of post 1990 is much different from the India of pre 1990. So that's why even if when we look at the banking scene, 1969 and 1980 are major milestone years because those were the years of nationalization of banks. But then I would say that what happened in 1991 and immediately thereafter has had a much bigger impact on the banking scene per se, because the orientation of banking, the purpose of banking, the disintermediation which can be caused by banking, and the role of public sector banks all underwent a change post 1990. From a time when banks were told that housing loan is not to be given, I can tell you that right now, if you look at the State Bank's portfolio, the largest lender in the country, I shall come to the question of valuation in a while, the largest lender in the country with total loans and advances of about 25 lakh crore. The next biggest lender is HDFC Bank, which has got loans and advances of about 12 lakh crore. So out of this 25 lakh crore of loans and advances of State Bank of India, today, as we speak, the largest portfolio is that of housing loans at more than 5 lakh crores. So over the last about 30 years, the changes that have happened have come about because of the reorientation of our macroeconomic policies. And in that context, I should also tell you that when the licenses for the new private sector banks were being given, the ICICI got converted into a universal bank. IDBI became a universal bank. UTI Bank, which is the forerunner of the present day Axis Bank, was set up during that time. So bank licenses for new private sector banks were issued at that time. And one of the senior consultants engaged by the government those days on behalf of McKinsey had told me recently that during the discussions in the 1990s, when the licenses were supposed to be given, there was a fear that the private sector banks will one day overtake the public sector banks totally, and maybe the public sector banks as a group may cease to exist. When we see the developments in the banking sector over the last 30 or 35 years, we can see that the public sector banks have stood their ground against the competition from the private sector banks. And I shall just take two examples of other sectors where the public sector has almost withered away completely. We all know during the 1990s, the telephone system in the country was monopolized by the state government entity, the BSNL. Now the BSNL is nowhere to be seen. And in the telephone and the mobile telephone sector, the public sector has been totally wiped out. The role of the public sector is not there at all. And the private sector has taken complete dominance. This is one example of what has happened in one sector. The second sector that I shall tell you, where the public sector has again lost ground completely to the private sector, is civil aviation. Again, we know Air India had a monopoly at that time. And I remember, in fact, in 1989 or 90, Getting a ticket to Mumbai from Thiruvananthapuram through Air India was a question of lobbying for a ticket. And from that position of a total monopoly, the government-owned entity is now given up for disinvestment. Has been disinvested, in fact. The Tatas have taken over. And in the civil aviation sector now, only the private sector players exist. But when you compare the banking sector, I have a short presentation which I shall start maybe after 3-4 minutes of preliminary comments. The public sector has been able to hold its own and has played also a very crucial role in inclusive growth. The purpose of nationalization in 1969-1980, I would strongly argue that it was a requirement of those times, because given the development trajectory which we undertook, the development requirements that we had, there was need for a shift from that class banking to mass banking, which was the raison d'etre for the nationalization exercise. And it had paid good dividends, though there were attendant problems of loan melas, debt waivers, loans going under political compulsions, politically directed lending. There were attendant problems. I'm not denying that. But then social banking as an objective, which is required in a large country like ours, where even now millions of people are living below the poverty line or leading marginal, standards of living are marginally higher than what we call the poverty line. There is a need for inclusive growth. And that inclusive growth can come on account of mediation by government-owned banks. I shall give you 2 examples of how this mediation by government-owned banks, even in the post-reform period of 1990, has led to a change on the ground. When Mr. Modi came to power in 2014, one of the major initiatives that he took, and which has, I think, stood the country also in good stead, and I shall explain why, was the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana account opening program, which was a massive drive of account opening for the poorer sections of society. As we speak today, the total number of new accounts opened for poor people who barely maintain maybe 1,000 rupees, 2,000 rupees in their accounts, which are not accounts which will be entertained by any private sector bank. The total number of accounts is about 46 crore. Out of this 46 crores of PM Jan Dhan Yojana accounts, 44 crore accounts have been opened by public sector banks. And the total of accounts opened by the private sector banks is just 2 crore. The total number of accounts opened by a bank like State Bank of India alone is 13 crore PM Jan Dhan Yojana accounts. So you can see the scale of operations of the public sector system. Out of the 2 crore accounts opened totally by the private sector banks, including the new private sector banks and the old private sector banks, the largest share is by one private sector bank, which opened 48 lakh accounts. The second is by another private sector bank, which has opened 24 lakh accounts. Now, for people like us who are discussing the role of the public sector, the private sector, privatization, issues of ownership, which are indeed critical, efficiencies, capital adequacy, etc. Our Veeramani sir is there. So these are indeed critical issues. But I would also argue that there are collateral benefits of the social banking. And in a large country where there is need for inclusive growth, the activities which are undertaken for account opening, for instance, cannot be discounted from the overall discourse of the sectoral ownership of the banking system. Now, I shall tell you one practical use of how this PM Jan Dhan Yojana scheme has come to the aid of the public exchequer and people interested in policy like us. During the pandemic, during 2020-21, it was decided by the government that they will transfer 500 rupees to women PM Jan Dhan Yojana account holders, numbering about 20 crore through their accounts over 3 months. Every month, 500 rupees was transferred to the account of women account holders of PM Jan Dhan Yojana. The total number of women who were beneficiaries under the scheme was 20 crore. The transfer of money to all these accounts took place on a single day and without any leakage whatsoever. All the women beneficiaries, 20 crores of them, got this cash transfer into their accounts. 1,500, not a big sum by our standards, but when activity was totally shut down, there was now no economic activity. Food grains were being given free. Even now, the government is giving food grains free up to March 2022. 5 kg of rice or wheat per person who is listed in ration cards, numbering about 80 crores. It is being given free. At that time, in addition to this free rations, it was decided to give this 500 rupees. And it was possible to transfer this money overnight into the accounts. More importantly, let me tell you, we should all be proud and glad that the entire money got transferred to these people without even a rupee's leakage. Whereas before the 1990s and before this exercise was taken up, we all remember Mr. Rajiv Gandhi saying that only the leakages of the public welfare scheme reaches the poor. I repeat what he said. He said quite openly that from the public welfare schemes in India, only the leakages, what gets leaked out, reaches the poor, which means majority of the money were going into the pockets of middlemen. Now, consider a scene where these kind of accounts had not been opened and the entire money was being transferred in a traditional way through the village offices or the revenue offices, or even through post offices. We know our culture where somebody gives 500 rupees and says this is subsidy being given to you by the government. He is totally honest and the entire money is handed over to the beneficiary. Our custom is that at least 50 rupees is given because some 500 rupees is coming into my hands and some person is bringing it. As we say, I think all of us understand Malayalam. Oru sandoshathinu 50 രൂപ കൊടുക്കും. Appa that is the kind of relationship that we have for transfer of money, transfer of benefits from the government to the poor beneficiaries of various schemes. I shall tell you two more examples of the contextualizing the role of the public sector banks. The PM Kisan scheme, under which 6,000 rupees of cash transfer is being done to about 9 crore farmers across the country. Some of them, I know, I have to admit, are not really, cultivating farmers. Maybe if I have a farm in, say, Tamil Nadu, and I have given it on lease because I am the owner, and if I register, and if I'm not a taxpayer, there is a check of tax payment online. If I'm not a taxpayer, I will also get this 6,000 rupees. So out of the 9 crore or 10 crore beneficiaries, I would estimate that maybe 6.5 to 7 crore are the cultivating farmers. 2 crores are people who have given their land on lease. But the point is that up to about March of 2021, totally 2 lakh crores were transferred by the government starting from December 2019. Not a rupee of leakage has happened. The entire money has got transferred by DBT, direct benefit transfer, to the accounts of these beneficiaries. This is one aspect of inclusive growth, prevention of corruption, prevention of leakages in public welfare schemes, subsidy schemes. There are any number of other benefits which have occurred on account of the inclusive growth agenda pursued by the government and the public sector banking system. I will now come to the asset side, loans and advances. We all speak about the NPA problem of the banks in general. and particularly the NPA problem of the public sector banks. Majority of the loans which have become NPAs and which have now been recognized and provisioned for, thanks to the intervention of Mr. Raghuram Rajan during 2015, when the Reserve Bank of India as a regulator put a stop to the restructuring schemes. Till then, till 2015, it was possible to restructure a loan and keep that loan as a standard asset. Even after the loan is restructured, it could be shown as a standard asset. So he called this exercise kicking the can down the road. And he said, if you restructure, it should be categorized as a substandard asset or as an NPA. You are free to restructure. Categorize as an NPA upon restructuring, make provisions, with the result that the massive, number of restructuring stopped, and accounts were categorized as NPAs which had undergone restructuring. Be that as it may, most of the large accounts which were restructured were in the core sector, the 8 core sectors of steel, cement, coal, so on, and also in infrastructure. There also, the lenders who were prominent in lending for the infrastructure sector were public sector banks. I'm not dealing with the question of whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but I am just pointing to you the factual position that whether you take the Bengaluru Airport, International Airport, the Mumbai Airport, or the Delhi Airport, or many road projects in the country which were taken up under PPP, the private-public partnership model. Majority of the loans that come from the public sector banks and the private sector banks as a strategy. For instance, HDFC Bank. I would say that looking back, it was a good strategy to keep away totally from this infrastructure lending. HDFC Bank did not touch even one single loan of infrastructure lending. ICICI Bank was involved to a certain extent in infrastructure lending, which is why ICICI Bank's gross NPA ratio even now is almost at the same level as State Bank of India's, about 4.5 or 5%. HDFC Bank took a conscious decision to stay away from this infrastructure lending. Now, purely on banking principles, I would say that it was a wise decision. It was a decision which kept them totally out of the NPA mess. But when you look at the development perspective and when you look at the benefits that the country has derived, I feel that the infrastructure lending has led to economic activity around these infrastructure investments. And the benefits have not flown to the banks or the lenders, but the benefits have flowed to the economic system per se. I'll just take one example. There is a national highway between Indore and Ujjain. It is one of the best highways, and if anybody has traveled that highway, they can vouchsafe for this fact. It is, I remember, an 8-lane highway funded by mostly the public sector banks. Before the Kumbh Mela of Ujjain in 2014, the 2014 or 15, the road had been laid, funded by the public sector banks. Economic activity was boosted. The entire flow of traffic during the Kumbh Mela and subsequently, even now, if somebody were to go to Ujjain, they can travel that road. The account became an NPA. But I strongly believe that the infrastructure lending which was done had led to great collateral benefits in terms of the heightened economic activity which happened, including transport, the finished goods which got transferred, agricultural activity which got benefited, so on and so forth. So my basic premise before starting the presentation is that the public sector banks in the country have played a great role in inclusive growth, in infrastructure lending, but also have had attendant problems. Maybe some of it was politicized or directed lending. Our Prime Minister says telephone banking took place. I wouldn't be able to comment, but maybe there were instances of telephone banking also where directed lending took place. And those are mistakes which ought to be, prevented. Now, let me get to the presentation straightway. And then I shall be open to some questions and answers. And I shall be making my comments on the privatization attempt by the government of India as part of the presentation. The topic is privatization of government banks and allowing higher promoter stake for the private banks. The government, as a matter of policy, after this Atmanirbhar package was announced, said that in non-strategic areas, the government's presence will be totally taken out. And in strategic areas, including finance, the government will see to it that it has about 4 entities which will control the government stake in those areas. This has been the stated position of the government, not only in banking, in other areas which they have identified as strategic also. The government has decided that its role will be limited and it will allow the private sector to come in. It will allow also foreign direct investment to come in. And this is because when Mr. Modi came to power, he said very openly, the government has no business to be in business. That is the theoretical basis for this kind of approach. And if I can go to the next slide. A brief on the Indian banking sector as we speak today. The aggregate deposits of the banking system today stand at 1,51,000 crores of rupees. It was at about 107 lakh crores in 2016-17. It has shown a steady increase, which means that the banking sector has succeeded and has been successful in mobilizing the savings of people around the country by penetrating into all areas, semi-urban, rural, the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, tier 6 centers, northeastern states, states like Uttarakhand, all the states put together, the banking network, which includes both the public and private sector banks, have been able to mobilize the savings, and consequently, the deposit, accretion or the deposits have gone up from 107, and more particularly, let's look at that 1920 to 2021, which was the pandemic year, when economic GDP was negative. We are, seeing a growth in the deposits of the banking system from 135 lakh crores to 151 lakh crore. So when economic activity was negative, output was negative, there has been a savings accretion or an accretion to deposits in the banking sector. When you look at gross bank credit also, there has been growth over the last 5 years from a level of about 78 lakh crore of total loans and advances. Right now, it is about 109 lakh crore. And even during last year, mainly following the Atmanirbhar package, where loans like the emergency, credit loans to the MSME sector under a government guaranteed scheme. Then out of the 20 lakh crore of Atmanirbhar package which was announced, I remember 16 lakh crore or 17 lakh crore were by loans through the banks guaranteed by the government, so that there was no impact on the government's balance sheet. So collaterally guaranteed by the government, but the money was supposed to flow from the bank system. Maybe as a result of that also, during this pandemic year also, from 103 lakh, the advances had gone up to 109 lakh. The credit to GDP ratio, which is also an important factor which should be of interest to us, has increased from a level of about 51% to 55% as we speak. But when we compare the credit to GDP ratio of other countries which are developed in comparison to us, Russia, for instance, has a credit to GDP ratio of 88%. The UK has got 146%, 161% and 216% are the ratios for 2 other countries in comparison to our 55%. Now, among bankers and among people in finance, it is accepted that the scope for credit penetration in India is huge. And if we have to increase our GDP, if GDP growth has to take place at levels of 7%, 8% in real terms in future, and if we have to play catch up with China, whose GDP as we speak is about $14 trillion, ours is only about $2.75 trillion. So if we have to catch up with that, there is need for our GDP to grow for consistently next 5-10 years. The GDP growth has to be 8 to 10%. If GDP growth has to take place, the banking sector, I'm saying, has to lend, and the credit to GDP has to indeed go up. Next slide, please. The banking scene in India right now, there are 12 public sector banks which are present in the country after consolidation. The number of banks in 2011, public sector banks in 2011-12 was 27. From 27 public sector banks, the number has come down to 12. The private sector bank number is now 21. It has been more or less at the same level because a couple of banks like Lakshmi Vilas Bank and the Rajasthan Bank of Rajasthan Limited, if I remember, they all got merged. Yes Bank, for instance, had got, I think it can be called a public sector bank now. It is no more a private sector bank. So the private sector banks number remains more or less the same. The other bank players are not, major in terms of the market share. Foreign banks are 45 in number, very minor market share. Regional rural banks play a very specific role, nothing to do with corporate lending. They are present in the agri and MSME space in a big way. The small finance bank, like our ESAP Bank of Kerala, they have, I think ESAP Bank has maybe 15 or 20,000 crores of advances. I'm not sure, but not major players in comparison to even the public sector banks. The Equitas Bank, the AU Finance Bank, which is based out of Rajasthan. These are the major small finance banks. And then there are the payment banks who are not supposed to lend. They are in the payment space. And the number of bank branches in India runs into about 158,000, out of which the public sector banks still have about 70,000 branches. The regional rural banks are also owned by the public sector bank. So I would say that out of about 158,000 branches, 1 lakh branches are with the public sector banking system, about 36,000 with the private sector. The small finance banks are also in the private sector. So rest about 40,000 branches, 40 to 50,000 branches, you can say is in the private sector. Next slide. This is a very interesting slide, which will indicate the creeping up share of the private sector banks, both as a share of the aggregate deposits and gross advances. In 2010, the share of aggregate deposits of the private sector banks was 17%. And in 2020, over a period of 10 years, that 17% has gone up to 30%. It is a huge increase. It is almost a doubling of the market share. 17 to 34 is doubling of market share. So 17 to 30 is, I would say, a near doubling of market share in aggregate deposits. In gross advances, more particularly, you will see an exact doubling of the market share of the private sector banks in 10 years. 2010, the share of the private sector banks was 18, and now the share of the private sector banks in the total advances. This includes the corporate advances, the retail advances, the agricultural advances, MSME advances, all put together. It is at 36. And look at the share of the public sector. It has come down from 78 to 65, a dip which is significant in the deposit share. And in advances, a dip which is comparatively higher, from 77 to 60%. So which means that the public sector bank's role is getting circumscribed for various reasons. And the private sector bank's role is getting increased. And this is, I would submit, indicative of the trend of market share, which is going to arise in future, because we have decided to go along the path of privatization of even public sector banks. So this trend in all likelihood is going to increase. Next. Here we come into the issue of what our president also alluded to. What is it that we want? I spoke so much about social banking, so much about PM Jan Dhan Yojana accounts, infrastructure lending. At the end of the day, what do we want? We want, as policymakers, as people who have gathered for this, round table, we want an efficient banking system, which is sound and resilient, which has capital adequacy in line with international norms. And we want a system which is able to absorb shocks. Now, I would submit, and we all can agree, that by and large, the Indian banking system has been monitored and regulated on very sound principles, on conservative principles, on sound principles, on prudential norms. And we were not affected, friends, whether on account of I can go back to the 1997 Southeast Asian crisis. I was in the foreign exchange dealing room at that time. Bimal Jalan was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India. I remember there was a great scare whether our currency will also come under attack the way the Southeast Asian crisis happened. All the major ASEAN countries were affected. The tiger economies almost collapsed, but the Indian economy was not affected at that time, thanks to the prudent policies of the government of that day and the governor of the Reserve Bank of the time, the Reserve Bank top leadership, including Dr. Y.V. Reddy, who was deputy governor. I remember Bimal Jalan saying, we have nothing to worry. Our fridge is full. And what he meant was that foreign exchange reserves of the country in 1997-98, when the Southeast Asian crisis happened, had reached a stage from a problem of shortage in 1991. In 1998, we were able to tell the world, we are not fearful of a foreign exchange crisis. Our fridge is full, is what Mr. Bimal Jalan said. In 2008, when the global financial crisis happened, there was actually a problem of plenty, a flight of safety towards India. Capital flows came into India. India loosened its monetary policy. And thanks to the wise measures taken by Dr. Y.V. Reddy, who was the governor of the Reserve Bank of India and the top leadership of the Reserve Bank of India at that time, our economy was not buffeted by the 2008 crisis. Now move to 2019, 20 and 2021. I think credit goes in a large measure to the proactive steps taken by the Reserve Bank of India. The current governor, Mr. Shaktikanta Das, has also been very practical and pragmatic. I'm sure, again, I would allude to chartered account friends like Mr. Veeramani, that the Reserve Bank's approach, the government's approach has seen to it that liquidity is available in plenty in the market. Liquidity is available so that economic activity is not hampered. Though I am not happy with the fiscal push that has been given, the monetary push that is needed to be given to an economy which is contracting, which is collapsing, has been more than adequate. And this has been possible because we have more or less been able to build the banking system based on this capital ratio norms, which is the minimum capital ratio stipulated under Basel III. We need not go into the specifics. At the total level, the Basel norms, the international norms expect the banks individually to have a capital of 9%, 8% globally. We said, Reserve Bank said conservatively, we will be 9%. For domestically important and systemically important banks like State Bank of India, ICICI and HDFC, we have a capital conservation buffer and it should be 11.5%. Ultimately, the objective of the Reserve Bank of India, as summarized in the statement, which I will read out and which resonates with what the president said, and which will be the summary of my submission to you also, irrespective of public or private ownership, is that stronger capital positions, good governance, and efficiency in financial intermediation can be the touchstones of our endeavor, so that the financial needs of the productive sectors of the economy are met, while the integrity and soundness of banks and financial institutions are secured on an enduring basis. This is, I think, the sum and substance of the Reserve Bank's approach. This is the sum and substance of the approach which I, as a practicing banker, would also want to adopt, that there should be strong capital position, there should be good governance, there should be efficiency in financial intermediation, and there should be the financing needs of the productive sectors of the economy, including the rural sector. I would put it, add as my own, kind of amendment to this overall objective, that we need to meet the credit needs of the rural sector increasingly, where the growth is likely to happen. And the integrity and soundness of the banks and the financial intermediaries should be secured on an enduring basis. Next slide, please. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So here I shall tell you now, how safe or how sound are we when we look at the capital to risk weighted assets ratio. I'm just drawing your attention. All SCBs, all scheduled commercial banks have a capital adequacy ratio of average 16%, which is higher than the 11.5% prescribed by the Basel norms, which means our financial system, the banking system, based on the capital adequacy as a touchstone, is in safe territory. The public sector banks have 13.8%. The private banks have a higher capital adequacy of 18%. The foreign banks, which are actually, they're small in number, so their weightage is less. Overall, they have about 18%. But I'm submitting to you that the capital adequacy of the Indian banking system as we speak, and as captains of industry, people involved in business, I think you should all be reassured by the fact that the Indian banking system is adequately capitalized, and it is at 16%. There is the problem of the gross NPAs, which are still a hangover, but it has also been coming down for the banks, that by March 21 compared to even September 19, if you look at the all scheduled commercial banks, from 9.3 gross NPAs have come down to 7.5. And if you look at net NPAs, and net NPA is gross NPA minus the provisions which are held by the banks, which means actually if a 100 crore loan has turned bad, and if a bank has set apart, say, 50 crores towards that loan loss, it expects 100 crores to be lost maybe, but out of 100 crores, 50 crores has been set aside. So the gross NPA is 100 crore. The net NPA is 50 crore. If you arrive at the net NPA by taking into account the provisioning, then our system net NPA is only 2.4%, which means that most of the NPAs have been well provided for over the last 4 or 5 years. And capital adequacy is also assured. I am just pointing to the inherent soundness of our banking system in total per se. Next. Now we come to the RBI recommendations. Overall, I would submit that the RBI recommendations are acceptable recommendations. What RBI has recommended is that the extend instructions which allows promoter share as a minimum of 40% of paid up equity share capital of the bank for the first five years may continue. There was a discussion regarding bringing this share down to about 15%. The cap on promoter stake in long run of 15 years may be raised from the current levels of 15% to 26% of the paid up voting equity share capital of the bank, has been accepted by the Reserve Bank of India. Essentially, what it essentially means is that the Reserve Bank is comfortable with a higher promoter equity stake than what was permitted earlier. And there was, of course, the case of the Kotak Mahindra Bank, where the bank went to the court saying that dilution is not possible, or that they were not ready to adhere to the mandate of the Reserve Bank of India. And the working group's recommendation that there is no problem in letting a higher promoter share of 26% to be allowed to be continued is what has been accepted by the Reserve Bank of India. To my mind, this is not much of an issue. The major problem is to ensure by means of oversight, by means of audit inspection, by means of external verification, that governance standards, that board level oversight is not compromised, and no individual entity, irrespective of the ownership that it commands in a bank, is able to use the bank for its own private gains, like the way it had happened, unfortunately, in a couple of private banks. Next slide. So here also, it is an acceptance of a recommendation, which is in favor of relaxation of promoters' ownership, that you need not, set any intermediate sub-target for dilution of ownership, that the dilution of ownership which was insisted upon earlier need not be insisted upon now, that you are okay with a higher promoter share, and non-promoter share holding will be capped at 10% in the case of natural person or non-financial institutions, and at 15% in the case of all categories of financial institutions or entities. You forget about these percentages. My own view is that what the working group and the Reserve Bank intends to do is to ensure that the capping of promoters' share is done at a certain level. The capping of individual entities' share is also restricted at a certain level, so that there is no congruence of ownership or no control of ownership, by which an affairs of a bank are totally conducted under the control and under the direction of a single entity and for purposes of connected lending. This, I believe, should not happen even if the share ownership is, say, 40% or 50%. If the governance board oversight is adequate, and if the board is vibrant, and if oversight by regulatory agencies, the Reserve Bank has got the power to review and audit the books of accounts of any scheduled bank which is captured, which is a part of the second schedule of the RBI under Section 35 of the RBI Act. So that is a mandate which the Reserve Bank of India enjoys. And if that mandate is exercised prudently and comprehensively with proper tools of oversight, where also I believe maybe the Reserve Bank should improve the tools of oversight. If those tools of oversight are improved, audit is tightened internally, and audit function of the Reserve Bank is also improved and enhanced through, a new toolkit, as I would put it, and governance by way of a vibrant board is ensured. To my mind, these numbers, so 15%, 26%, let me ask you, instead of 26, what is the difference between 26 and 30? It is a question of a number. It doesn't indicate, because 51% is control. Below 51%, anything is a number in my view. So 51% has got some substance or some kind of meaning. Anything below 51% is just a number for which there is no logic in my view. The logic is to ensure that there is no individual control, no connected lending, no diversion of funds, no malafide in the running of a bank, for which I think only external oversight and internal governance by means of a vibrant board is ensured, and for which the regulator has a great responsibility. Next slide, please. The minimum track record for NBFCs, I think I was looking at the, no, before this and before that. Yeah, so the minimum track record, this is an attendant, what do you call, guideline, that NBFCs, it was stipulated that if they have a track record of 10 years, they can apply for a universal bank. It doesn't mean they will get a universal bank license. For small finance banks like our AU Finance or ESAF or Equitas, if they have a 5-year, they can apply for a universal bank license. And the minimum capital, I think these are very reasonable sums. If somebody wants to have a bank like State Bank of India or even Bandhan Bank, which is a universal bank, they can do all activities which is permitted. The minimum capital has to be 1,000 crores. Small finance banks, it has to be 500 crores. And for urban cooperative banks, which are transiting to small finance banks, it has to be, 300 crores. And these are, sums of money which I believe are probably subject to, this is a reasonable sums of money. For starting a bank, if somebody doesn't have a capital of 300 crores, I don't think anybody should be given a license even to start a small finance bank. It is a no-brainer and nothing, no matter discussing these figures in depth. Next. Yeah, this is, I think, one of the major points where I agree with, that a non-operative financial holding company model should be the preferred structure for all new licenses to be issued for universal banks. And this is in line with the PGNI committee recommendation, where he suggested the structure even for the public sector banks. I would say that even for the private sector banks, where if there is a non-operative holding company which is holding the shares, the relative opportunity for influencing decision making making by the promoters is reduced to that extent because of a layer which is constructed through the non-operative financial holding company. So on account of the layering effect, on account of the filtering effect, on account of the control and oversight effect which can be exercised by the non-operative financial holding company, the opportunity to directly influence decision making gets reduced. And I think that is a good structure which should be followed by all the private sector banks, and it should also be followed by the public sector banks. And that is why when we were talking initially, this is a recommendation made by PJ Nayak, if I remember, around 2015 or 16 for the public sector banks also, so that the DFS or the Ministry of Finance has no opportunity to do telephone banking in future, which Mr. Modi, our Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister, has been talking about. Right now, because there is no holding company model, the government has got an opportunity to directly telephone the public sector banks and give directions, because there is no independent holding company structure. So I believe that is a structure which ought to be created both for the public sector and the private sector banks. And now we move to the, I think, the last slide, which is in some my take. What is my view, summing up, and then we can have 10 or 15 minutes for some interaction. I believe, given the development status in which we are in, a developing country, the third largest economy, not the third largest, the fifth largest economy in the world, aspiring to play catch up with the second largest economy in the world, because China has got a per capita GDP of $12,000. The economy is $14 trillion. The population is somewhere around 1.4 billion Chinas. With the result, the per capita GDP is about $11,000 to $12,000. And where are we? We have a similar population of 1.3 billion, and the economy is only $2.75 trillion. Our per capita GDP is less than $2,000. So if we want to catch up with another country of similar magnitude, geostrategically, also our neighbor, rival, and if we want to grow, then we should remember that we ought to have efficiency, but we ought to have growth also. And for that kind of growth to happen, I believe the public sector character of the Indian banking system is a great safeguard in terms of the trust, in terms of the confidence that it gives to the investor. Here, I will take just only one example. In 1999, all of us remember that Indian Bank was almost about to be wound up. Mr. K.V. Kamath, who was a member of the CIA task force at that time, and who was a member or president of the CIA also, and he was also associated with ICICI Bank, a private bank. He headed a committee which recommended that Indian Bank should be wound up. But friends, let me tell you, what did not cause a run on Indian Bank? People did not queue up to withdraw money from Indian Bank because of the public sector character of the bank, because they knew it is a government bank. Whatever happens, there is a sovereign guarantee which comes in inherently for deposits in the banking system, irrespective of the DICGC coverage. And this trust is the greatest capital. This confidence that the banking system has got to the government's backing is the greatest capital adequacy, which cannot be captured in any numbers. So therefore, I would submit that if capital adequacy as calculated based on Basel norms is 13%, there is an unwritten, uncaptured, unfigured capital adequacy, which comes to this banking system per se on account of the overall dominance of the public sector banks and government ownership per se. And that should continue, in my view, is, I am definitely of that view. And I also would cite that in India, we have to answer this criticism. When private banks have failed, Madhu Dandavate said that we follow, at that point of time in 1977, we follow the practice of privatization of losses and nationalization of profit. So we also, like the Yes Bank, which happened, the earlier Nedungadi Bank, which was absorbed by Punjab National Bank, the GTB, which was absorbed by Oriental Bank of Commerce. We also have been following this policy because no private bank can also be allowed to fail. Therefore, the public sector banking character of the Indian banking system should continue. Subject to this, disinvestment is not an issue. If you take the two banks which are discussed as probable candidates, I can tell you one of the banks has got total advances of 2,50,000 crore. SBI's agricultural advance alone is equal to 2,25,000 crore. So I would say even with these two public sector banks being privatized, the overall character will not change, but it becomes incumbent upon large lenders like SBI, the larger, consolidated banks in the public sector banks, to make the leap forward, make the journey forward, to keep their market share at 65 to 70% continuously, or the government should see to it and enable the public sector banks to have that market share, because that character and that nature is the strongest safeguard for the efficiency of the banking sector. The third point is the holding company model, which I already told you. India's central bank, I'm happy to state, has been very mature and prudent in its regulation, subject to, of course, the caveat that in terms of microprudential regulation, it ought to improve its performance. Macroprudential, it is okay. I would submit that it has tools, it ought to develop its toolkit to ensure that microprudential regulation is more effective from the Reserve Bank side. The next opportunity for credit growth lies in infrastructure and also lending in the rural and semi-urban centers. Huge opportunity. Here I will tell you one of the results of the National Sample Survey. The debt to assets ratio of a rural household, friends, let me draw attention to this, ratio. It is the total indebtedness to assets ratio of a rural household is 3.8%, which means if he has got 100 rupees of asset, the loan outstanding is only 3.8. Of an urban ordinary household, the ratio is 4.4, which means 100 rupees of assets it has, indebtedness is only 4.4. Actually, if we properly mediate and if we properly structure the loans, there is potential to lend more and collect more from these households. And only through lending, only through a credit card culture, the way America progressed. America didn't progress through saving, it progressed through spending. Private spending, private consumption, it will lead to private investment. Private spending, private consumption to happen, lending has to happen. Private spending will lead to private consumption. Private consumption will lead to private investment. Private investment will lead to credit growth, bank credit. Bank credit growth will lead to higher investment, and a virtuous cycle will happen of the growth, potential growth of India to reach 8 or 10% continuously in future. Along with this, higher government expenditure is also required, at least in the immediate future, because right now the private sector is not stepping up its capital investment. The government has to spend more both at the state and the central level, subject to fiscal considerations and on what kind of expenditure they are spending, not for revenue, but for capital investment, so that crowding in of private investment will happen. And governance standards and board level oversight, this cannot be overemphasized, because this, I believe, is at the crux of the issue, that if you are a board member, you will not stand a party to any decision making which is to line, which is in alignment with promoters' interest, that you will uphold shareholders' interest or you will uphold stakeholders' interest at all costs. Only the board members' individual integrity can ensure that. Governance standards, the management has to ensure. Board level oversight, board members, and no substitute is there for this kind of oversight, because ultimately any system is only as good as the people who work the system. The system cannot be a replacement for people. If India has grown, it has grown because of good leadership, whether it is inside institutions or outside institutions in the political space. It is not because of the institutional structure per se. It is because of individual leadership qualities, both inside institutions and outside of institutions. So I shall end with this submission that all of us have to remember that the country will be as good. Institutions will be as good, whether it is the Chamber of Commerce or State Bank of India. The institutions will be only as good as the individuals who make it. And ultimately, the individual, moral fiber has to be attuned to the national objectives, and there has to be a higher purpose. And that is the guarantee to ensure that efficiency, capital adequacy, stability, and security of the financial system and the banking system continues and endures. So here I, close my submission. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at your forum. I think took, I thought of taking 45 minutes. I exceeded about 15 minutes. But in your program, anyway, it was put as 8 to 9:30. So now I'm open to any kind of comments. I wouldn't say even questions, because I don't think I'll be able to answer questions from such an elite, group. But if there are comments or suggestions, I will be benefited. Honestly, I speak from my heart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adikesan, for reassuring us. It was a very, very passionate speech. It was a very, very objective speech, and let us all thank you for that. And thank you again for reassuring that the banking system is effective. It is sound and it is resilient. And thank you also for telling us that successive governors have given us, a lot of reassurance that they have played the regulatory role quite effectively. Now coming to, see, there are one or two questions basically. See, you were talking about the universal banks and all that. My question is the era of universal banks over? Because is there any need for niche banking? Like, because of the RAM sector, that is retail agri, MSME sector, infrastructure financing sector, is there any necessity for niche banking?
Yeah, good. Very, very good question. And yeah, I think I would submit that given the status of our economic development, there is space for universal banks, but there is space for niche banks also to grow and gain in the market through concentrating on what they are good at. For instance, HDFC Bank, doesn't give housing loans. It may be, I don't know whether everybody is aware. HDFC Bank doesn't give housing loans. HDFC, the institution, gives housing loans. HDFC Bank may source and then it buys portfolio for its own requirement. So it is actually niche banking which is being done by HDFC. HDFC Bank, people think it is, it is the market leader in housing loans. The market leader is actually HDFC, the institution which is holding shares in HDFC Bank. So that is an indication of niche banking. Again, infrastructure, you are right. I think, and that is why the government has thought of a development financial institution, NAB, the National Bank for Infrastructure Development, NABFID. They are trying to promote, and they have set apart 20,000 crores as equity. Yes, with the going away of ICICI and IDBI, and our Mr. Pradeep Kumar, who was the MD of State Bank of India and currently BBB member, has been a firm advocate of this, that the developmental financial institution ought to come back. So I would agree with you that niche banking has got scope, and perhaps the small finance bank, which aspire to become universal banks, perhaps they should look at opportunities for becoming maybe niche banks. But the licensing is, at present, there is no license like a niche bank license. You understand, there is a development financial institution which may be in the nature of an infrastructure bank. Which will be in the nature of an NBFC. HDFC, I think, is an NBFC. So therefore, there is an NBFC license which will be given. There is a small finance bank which will be given license. A universal bank license from a regulatory perspective, a niche bank is not being thought of as a license. But from a market opportunity perspective, I think niche banking has got greater scope. So from a strategic perspective, what you say makes sense, that in terms of journey forward for certain banks, instead of trying to become everything to everybody, which is what universal banking is all about, and which you may be incapable of, you may be better off by providing niche banking services. Yes, whether it is the SME space or agri space, and there are efforts being made by entities to get into this. And as a strategic thought, I think it's a great point that you are making of niche banking as a strategic objective of banking per se.
So thank you very much. Now there is, there is a talk about growing neobanks, emerging payment technology, super apps. All these things are going to redefine banking. Yeah. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I agree that, essentially, they are speaking about even open banking. Open banking in Sydney, for instance, in 2018, I attended a international seminar convened by SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. So at that time itself, open banking was being discussed. By open banking, what is meant is that if you or I are able to share our willing to share our data, then we are not, consumer or customer of any particular bank. If our data can be shared, then I am able to access the banking services of any bank or a payment bank or a digital bank. So you are no more a customer of a particular bank. You are the owner of your own, the services that you want to take. It is going to be disruptive. But there again, I tell you, that is why the public sector banks ought to be given credit for, playing catch up. For instance, speaking about SBI, the YONO app of SBI, there are, problems with that, not problems, I would say. There is need for greater, kind of integration and greater user friendliness. This is my personal view. Please don't quote me, but I am actually speaking in favor of the app. But let me submit to you, it is one of the greatest innovations and digital transformations undertaken by a public sector bank. And the Kotak Mahindra chairman, Mr. Uday Kotak, when he came for a conference about 2 years ago, he said YONO has caught on in the market and private sector banks are sitting up and taking notice. And some of them, like ICICI Bank, have taken a leaf out of this and tried to modify their digital platform, which is just to tell you that the public sector banks are alive to the transformation that is happening, one aspect of it. But let me also tell you, sir, I have, in my current role, I am more engaged with what is happening in the rural and semi-urban sectors. See, there are millions of people right now in the country who are totally cut away. Somebody was speaking about, I think, 2 Indias or 3 Indias. See, there are many Indias, as we know. When we travel to the countryside, I recently traveled to Arunachal Pradesh and Guwahati. The entire Northeast, if you travel, their status of development is something totally cut off, except maybe the towns and cities, the villages are totally cut off from the level of digitization, level of connectivity even that we are talking about. So therefore, let me also give you one figure, sir, which will indicate the extent of, the contextualize the topic of digitization. The cash in circulation at the time of the demonetization in India, cash in circulation was 17 lakh crore. Cash in circulation, cash with the public. Right now, as we speak, the cash and currency in circulation is 29 lakh crore. Whereas the GDP has not grown so much. So from 17 lakh crore of currency in circulation, despite digitization, currency in circulation is 29 lakh crore. So it indicates that there are traditional modes of transaction which take place. Even in Thiruvananthapuram, for instance, when people go to a restaurant, I have seen people paying in cash. I have rarely seen people paying through card. Whereas there are, areas of touch points where, delivery, Amazon delivery, Swiggy, yes, that is happening. But so there is space because we constitute 1.3 billion out of 7 billion. I believe that there is scope for both digitization, disruption, then lessons will be learned. There is scope for cash, traditional methods, people will catch up. So there is scope for everything, and there is scope for growth in all these areas. This is my view.
Thank you. See, are these fintech companies going to challenge the mainstream banks?
Yes. The fintech companies will be able to challenge in terms of, I would say the challenge will come at the policy makers level in terms of the disruptive potential that they have. Let me make a distinction between actual disruption and disruptive potential. Now, when a new innovation comes in fintech, I have seen, public sector bank chiefs taking note of the disruptive potential. But in terms of the actual impact, let me make it very clear. I have seen the volumes being generated, not so much disruptive to traditional banks, because if they had been actually disruptive, the traditional banks would have felt threatened in terms of, their volumes of business, etc., going down, the number of accounts being opened, etc., going down, the deposit accretion coming down, etc. That has not yet happened. So while I'm saying it has got disruptive potential, it has not demonstrated actual, disruption on the ground. So that is what I have felt about the fintech companies. They have a potential which ought to be taken note of, which has been taken note of. But actually, whether they have been successful in disrupting, I feel based on my experience, the disruption that they have caused is marginal and tolerable, and perhaps can be coped with by the traditional banking system. I, for one, would wish that they cause higher disruption, because only when you are challenged will you make changes. So that is my wish.
Thank you, sir. See, there was another report by Fox Business that conventional bank branches will virtually close down by 2034 because banks branches has anyway been coming down, and branches might get closed down by 2034. I think you also must have seen that newspaper report.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. That is, see, brick and mortar banking, I have also been like in 2020, 2001 itself, see, click, mouse click banking versus brick and mortar banking was thought of as a topic. And then it was discussed that foreign banks, in fact, Citibank and others, are charging customers for making a visit to the bank. That if you come to the bank, you will be charged. I worked after that in 2006 to 10 in Singapore, which is one of the, it is as good as a developed country. Size is small, but in terms of technology adoption, any which way you look at it, they are almost on a par with the developed world. You have a system like POSB, the Post Office Savings Bank there, which is part of the DBS group. I have found people, the branch network being there, people going to the bank, conducting business. Even now, when I speak to Singapore, my friends in Singapore, the branch network has not diminished. The brick and mortar structure has not been closed down. Even in a developed economy where people are tuned to using technology in a massive way, I think brick and mortar has got certain advantages, the touch and feel. You go to a branch, you speak to people, meeting people. Canada, for instance, where, I visited Canada maybe 3 years ago. Canada is a developed country having a strong banking system. It was one of the few countries not to be affected by the 2008 crisis. The traditional Bank of Montreal, Bank of Nova Scotia, they have not closed down branches. And even recently, also a friend of mine has gone from India to work in a bank in Canada. I think brick and mortar, in my view, has not, even in UK, the brick and mortar branches have not been closed down to that extent. Maybe expansion of brick and mortar is not happening the way it happened at a particular growth phase in our time during the 1780s. But I think it is not a time to write the obituary of the brick and mortar structure. Because the touch and feel, speaking to people has got its own advantages. And that is again the character of Indian the way Indians conduct banking. They prefer to meet people, more comfortable with going to a place, conducting a business at the branch premises, even though there are options outside, etc. I don't know whether I am outdated, younger. See, I am 59, 60. So there is probably a generational issue in my thinking also. I do not know. So anybody younger may be able to throw some light on this.
Mr. Veeramani, our vice president and an auditor to many banks, he has 1 or 2 questions he has put in the chat box. I would request him to ask directly so that
yes,
it gets addressed.
Veeramani, sir.
Good morning. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Don't you think the employee cost for the public sector banks is a big factor? Because we have the wage revision every 5 years. And the reason employee pension benefits has costed the public sector bank 21,000 and odd crores. Don't you think in a scene of when you are competing with your private sector, this is going to be a big factor for you?
Sir, excellent question. And I'm sure that you have looked at the figures also. And this also, this is being recorded, but I would submit that let this be, circulated only within this group. See, we had a study of State Bank of India. The per capita employee cost of State Bank of India is coming to about 18 lakh per employee cost is about 18 lakh. 53 1,000 crores was the total staff cost, which was part of the operating cost last year. The per employee cost of private sector banks like HDFC and ICICI Bank is only 3 lakh. Whereas in HDFC Bank, I studied this issue and we are thinking of a strategic solution for this. So when we studied the per capita employee cost of private sector banks, it is only 3 lakh at the per capita level. But even as the per capita cost is 3 lakh, there are 152 people in HDFC Bank who are drawing salaries above 1 crore, which means actually the compensation structure in the public sector banks is inverted. We are paying more at the bottom of the pyramid, the clerical level and up to the AGM level. Upwards of AGM, there is not much of a salary difference. I can tell you, my salary as a CGM is only 5,000 or 10,000 rupees different from the salary of a DMD. Actually, as a DMD, the responsibility is much higher. My salary as a CGM is only 15,000 rupees, 20,000 rupees different from that of a GM. Whereas the powers, the authority to be exercised is different. So your question is right, that unless the public sector banks find out a means of reducing staff costs strategically, their cost to income ratio, which is quite high right now, above the cost to income ratio of SBI is 53%, whereas the cost to income ratio of private sector banks are 45, 40, below 50. And even if it is between 45 and 50, our net profit will increase. And that is a factor which we have to address. And it has to be, tackled, because the bipartite is a rigid cost structure. And the bipartite is providing a salary structure which is not sustainable, at least for the type of small loans which we want to service. With the result, actually, see, I had recently, like last week, I went for a conclave. Again, not to be quoted, let it be kept within, because it might be seen as anti-employee. I went for a conclave. A protocol officer who was accompanying me is an engineer, and he had spent 3 years in TCS. After 3 years in TCS, a distinction holder in engineering comes and joins the bank as a PO, probationary officer. I asked him why. He said 3.75 lakhs was the payment in TCS for a 3-year-old engineer. Here, he has joined about 6 months ago. He is getting 8.75 lakhs or 9 lakhs. I am not against that payment. But if we have to do your farmer loans, your SME loans, where the return is only 9% and 10%, you cannot afford to pay this much for the feet on the street, for deploying enough feet on the street. So this is a very important question, and it ought to be addressed. It will cause some problems. Again, addressing this is not easy because the unions, are involved. So that's why I said, let this discussion, because I'm not anti-union. I'm all for equity as we, and I am sure people like Veeramani sir, Hari Kumar sir, we are all for equitable growth. We don't want to be leading luxurious lives when people are, living in poverty. But at the same time, we cannot afford to have disparity of pay and then rigidities of wages and employment. People will walk away at 5 o'clock, whereas in the private sector bank, they will work. We cannot then compete. Essentially, then we will be like the KSRTC vis-a-vis the private banks service. We will be kicking ourselves if we do that.
So
there are one or two.
What I was trying to find out was that, public sector bank, it is not the employee costs who are in service which is hitting the bank. It is actually the pension and the family pension benefits, which are a big strain on the public sector banks, which the private sector banks do not have to face.
Yeah, that included. That's why I said, see, the mediation has to come by way of some solution. Or let me put it very simply, without elaborating too much, we should outsource as much as possible. Reserve Bank of India has told very clearly that except determination of KYC, mind you, not even the processing of KYC documents, determination of KYC, sanction of loan, not the processing or preparation of loan document, data entry, nothing. Internal audit, except these three, everything else can be outsourced. So I'm answering your question. How do we, reduce the already? And I'm sure under the latter day staff who are joining are not enjoying the benefits of the older pension scheme. So there is a reduction which is happening. But if you ask me strategically what should be the approach, I would say that strategically the approach should be outsource as much as possible or do as much work as possible outside of the bipartite, scheme of things. That is the solution.
The other point you said is that, the private banks with a CRAR of about 18% are much stronger than the public sector bank. What don't you feel that sitting on a capital and not a poor lending program could be one reason why they are able to maintain this 18% capital adequacy, whereas public sector bank has to go for a capitalization almost every year?
I'm not sure whether I used stronger. Probably I'll remember. What I meant was higher capital adequacy only.
Yeah, that
higher.
not
Not stronger, definitely, because see, that is why governance and oversight. See, till the problems of Yes Bank were discovered, Yes Bank was saying its capital adequacy is 14%, 15%. So I'm not sure actually what. And there have been, see, I didn't want to be critical. There have been, we all know the governance issues which happened in ICICI Bank. Unfortunately, a Padma Bhushan awardee is now accused in a criminal case, a former chairperson of the bank. So the same governance issues were raised in Axis Bank on account of which the chairperson, a woman, had to quit. Unfortunate. I'm not making a comment. So I'm saying that higher capital adequacy ratio per se doesn't indicate strength, and more importantly, a higher capital adequacy may be indicative of an inefficient usage of capital also.
Absolutely.
There are one or two more questions in the chat box. I will just read it so that at least you'll be able to answer shortly, and then we'll be able to conclude.
Yeah.
Mr. Jairam Nair is asking, the low credit deposit ratio of 55%, is it reflective of the reluctance of the branch managers to lend retail and MSME sector loans out of apathy or fear psychosis?
Yeah. See, I shall answer that. Two things. One is right now the low credit deposit ratio, I would say, is a function of low credit demand from the corporate sector. Corporates have been deleveraging their balance sheets after the IBC has come. IBC has been a game changer. Earlier, I tell you, Mr. Jairam Nair, if I recall, I think he's a banker. If I'm not sure. Anyway,
I was chairman of Dhanlakshmi Bank earlier.
Yeah, right.
And XRB.
XRB, yeah, right. So I'll tell you. So I'll tell you, 2014-15, when I was in charge of, I have done corporate banking continuously from 2001 to 2016. And till then, people used to come, corporates who have borrowed, used to come and say, sir, if you don't do this, your account will become an NPA. See, your account meaning his account with me will become an NPA. And the way he would talk is, unless you support us with additional finance, your account, that is my account in your bank, will become an NPA. IBC has put an end to that, and IBC has been a great enabler. Now, anybody who has got a dues of say 1 lakh rupees or maybe a higher amount right now, maybe 1 crore right now, but IBC has turned the tables and given the power back to the lenders. And because of, I think, the coming into being of IBC and the fear that owners could be dispossessed of their companies. It has happened in the case of Alok Industries, Jeeva Rajaka. I think he has been disposed. It is one of it was the largest integrated textile manufacturer in the country. Bhushan Steel, Bhushan Power and Steel are examples. Now, because of that, corporates have been trying to deleverage to reduce their dependency, particularly on bank debt. That is one reason. Second reason is fear is there. Let me tell you my own experience. And this is, I want to share this. Last week, I received a call from an inspector in CBI saying that 27 people have been identified for evidence taking in relation to a loan which I had signed as a DGM in credit in State Bank of Mysore in 2011. Now, friends, let me tell you, this is the 5th time I am being called by CBI to give evidence under section 160 or 161 of the CRPC. Now, fortunately, I have not been made an accused. But as we all know, it lies within the powers of the inspector or the DYSP. If they can, at the end of their pen, if they write something, they can make me an accused. They have the power and the potential. Maybe there is no reason. Now, think of the trouble that I have to undertake. I have got a working group, report to be given to the government of India, of which I am a coordinator, report to be given by 15th of December. I am member of another committee within the bank where there's a timeline. This inspector calls me and tells me, "Aapko aana hai 15th or 16th." 15th, I said, I have to give the reports. 16th ko aa jaiye. Otherwise, 20th or 21st. And does the problem end with this? Now, the problem will be the beginning, because when the case is filed, after 10 years, I have seen retired GMs being summoned long after they are able to walk to give evidence in a court of law. Now, I would tend to think, why should I have touched any of these credit proposals? Had I been in treasury, had I not been involved in credit decision making, I wouldn't have had, and this is not the end of it. No, now this is the 5th time. I have touched 1,000 proposals during my time from 2001 to 2016. Now, given a choice, would anybody want to touch a credit proposal? Tell me. So that is also a fact. So that has to be addressed. I can be asked a question if there is a mala fide which is indicated in any file. But if I have taken a commercial decision and if I have not gained, why should I stand before an inspector of police and answer? It beats me. I am reaching the end of my career. And this is not the end, because retired CGM Hamsini Menon, who is in Kozhikode now, must be about 66, 67 years old. She is also finding a place in that list. She has to go to Delhi in this winter to stand before this inspector. What an atrocity, no? Why would people want to work? I am sharing this again, please don't quote me, but this is real life.
So that's the predicament of all
Thank you.
public sector employees.
Yeah.
So Mr. Venkatraman Anand, who is a member of our executive committee and who is the CEO of Harrison Malayalam Group, he has a question saying that asking whether the transformation in the public sector bank happened only when they are pressurized by the growth of private sector banks, or if they had approached a different approach, probably the private sector banks would not have grown to this level. That is the question.
Yeah, I think, see, essentially the principle is that of competition. No, the principle of being challenged. The entrance player, whoever it is, tends to get lazy and tends to do, tends to take things in its stride, whether it is banking or any other industry. Unless you are constantly challenged, I think unless there is competition in the market, unless there is a disruption of your, marketing model, of your business model, you will not try to be efficient. So I think in that sense, the presence of the private sector has definitely led to improvement in efficiencies. And had it not been for the private sector, yes, I think efficiencies wouldn't have come in the public sector. Because that's why I remember getting a ticket in Air India. All of us remember getting a ticket in Air India, you have to lobby with the manager to get a ticket in those days. Getting a telephone connection, you ought to know somebody in BSNL to get a telephone connection. And things have changed because of competition. So banking has also changed. So I have no, problem in admitting that unless the public sector banks had not been given the competition on account of the entry of the private sector banks, efficiency levels and their strategies wouldn't have changed. So it is good to have competition. But at the end of the day, I stand by my statement that as policymakers, the Reserve Bank, the government, all of us, I think, should internalize the fact that the public sector character, because that is the basic bedrock of the trust. The currency note, for instance, remember after the abolition of the gold standard for issue of currency in 1973, because of what is called the Nixon cut, there is no reserve to back any currency. It is just a piece of paper on which I promise to pay the bearer. There is no gold reserve, nothing to back this currency. It is only a sovereign guarantee that all fiat currencies enjoy. Like that, there is a sovereign guarantee, there is a sovereign trust that this banking system in the country, which is predominantly national and in the public sector, enjoys. And here again, I will quote Mervyn King, the former governor of Bank of England. When RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, went under, he made this remark: banks are international in life, but national in death, because they may be international when they are living and thriving. But when it comes to their collapse, the treasury of the government of the home country takes the hit. Banks are international in life, but they become national in death. It's a key statement. which is why I reiterate the importance of the dominance of the public sector character as a what do you call as a feature of the banking system. We all have a stake in it, and I have no doubt that that character should continue.
I think we are already at 9:35. You have time for one or two more questions, or we'll wind it up. It's
I
fine.
think we'll, yeah.
Okay.
My
So
only
I would-
request, is that something, because I have said which is meant for this group. So let it because you
Please
have
be
recorded.
reassured. Please be reassured. We will not get into that. I would now call upon. I seek kindly. I seek your pardon for not able to address one or two questions because of the paucity of time. I would now request Mr. P.M. Veeramani, the Vice President, to say the vote of thanks.
Good morning to all of you. The Cochin Chamber has always been proactive in taking current topics for discussion. And when the current topic of this banking came up, we wanted to think of a person who could be able to advocate with the people of Kerala. And the most familiar face, more than the chamber, more than anybody else, the most familiar face in today's banking in Kerala is that of Mr. Adi Keshavan, because we regularly see his smiling face in Manorama columns. And there is no doubt that today, the last 1.5 hours, he continues to be, though he was claiming that he was nearing 60 and all, he continues to be the bold and the beautiful as he was possibly in 73 onwards. We take this opportunity to thank Mr. Adi Keshavan for his very open views, and also the stressing on the fact that, the public sector banks should maintain its character and must remain there. And he also emphasizes the need that, both can coexist. Both the private sector and the public sector can coexist because they are regulated by the RBI regulations, which are common for the both private and the public sector also. We take this opportunity once again to thank you, and we hope we will be able to have a larger forum where Mr. Adi Keshavan can physically come and address a larger audience for us. Thank you very much, sir, for sparing your time today.
Thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Kamath. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It's a very wonderful session.
Mr.
Wonderful.
Menon. Absolutely. It was a wonderful session. It's not that we get people like that every day.
Exactly, sir.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Hari sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.